In cities across the world, something deeply unnatural appears just beneath our feet. First floors became basements. Streets rose by 10, 12, sometimes 15 feet. Windows that were clearly designed to let in light now stare out at concrete walls. Entire buildings seem to have sunk into the earth, not as ruins, not as ancient remnants, but as finished structures quietly buried and repurposed. Old photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries capture this anomaly in unsettling detail. Brick facades cut in half by new street levels, elegant doorways opening into nothing but dirt. Storefronts sealed below ground as if the city simply decided to forget they ever existed. These were not primitive settlements or medieval towns lost to time. These were industrial-era cities, photographed extensively, mapped carefully, and documented by governments that prided themselves on record-keeping. New York, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, London, Moscow. Different continents, different cultures, different histories, yet the same architectural scars appear again and again. Basement windows line the streets, not small utility vents, but large symmetrical openings framed with stone and ironwork. They look intentional. They look finished. They look like they were never meant to be underground. According to conventional logic, basements are afterthoughts, functional spaces, storage, foundations. But these spaces were built with light in mind, with ventilation, with aesthetics. Why would architects invest time and resources into decorating rooms that were supposedly never meant to be seen? Why do so many of these buried floors resemble ground-level commercial or residential spaces rather than structural foundations? The photographs raise even more troubling questions. In image after image, workers are not building upward, they are digging down. Entire streets are excavated, as if uncovering something pre-existing. Horse-drawn carts haul away enormous volumes of compacted earth, thick sediment, mud. In some cases, excavation reveals intact interiors beneath the surface, complete with plaster walls, door frames, and staircases that lead nowhere. These are not collapsed buildings. They are not destroyed ruins. They are finished rooms, sealed below a new ground level as if the city rose around them overnight. Official narratives suggest gradual development, urban growth, infrastructure upgrades, sanitation improvements. But the visual evidence feels abrupt, sudden, as if something forced the ground level higher all at once, leaving civilization to adapt after the fact. When these images are placed side by side, a global pattern begins to emerge. The same transformation occurring across multiple cities within a relatively narrow span of time. Not centuries apart, but decades. The late 1800s into the early 1900s. This is not mythology. This is not speculation pulled from ancient texts or distant legends. This is photographic evidence. Black and white images capturing a world in transition, or perhaps recovery. Something happened to the cities of the modern world, and whatever it was, it left behind a layer of silence, just as thick as the mud that buried the streets. Before we decide what it means, we must first confront the possibility that the ground beneath our cities is not merely the result of slow progress, but the aftermath of an event history never fully explained. When confronted with these images, official history offers reassurance. Cities, we are told, evolve. Streets are raised deliberately to improve drainage, reduce flooding, and modernize sanitation. After catastrophic fires, entire districts were rebuilt higher and stronger. Basements, according to this explanation, were always meant to be underground. What looks strange today was simply practical engineering at the time. And on the surface, this explanation seems reasonable. Documents exist. City records describe street-raising projects. Engineers wrote about sewer installation. Newspapers reported on reconstruction efforts after fires in Chicago, San Francisco, and Seattle. The story appears complete. But the discomfort begins when scale and consistency are examined more closely. Why were entire neighborhoods raised by such extreme amounts? 10 feet is not a minor adjustment. 15 feet is not cosmetic. Raising a single street is one thing. Raising an entire city, across multiple cities, across continents, within a similar historical window, is something else entirely. It is expensive, it is disruptive, and it requires an extraordinary justification. Photographs complicate the narrative further. In many cases, images show buildings already partially buried before reconstruction begins, not rebuilt higher, but surrounded by earth. Workers appear to be clearing streets rather than creating them. The material being removed is not rubble alone, but thick, uniform sediment packed tightly against walls and windows. This does not resemble the debris of demolition. It resembles deposition. Then there is the architecture itself. If these lower floors were always meant to be basements, why do they align so perfectly across entire streets? Why do doorways, windows, and interior layouts match those of upper floors? Why do staircases descend into spaces that appear identical to ground-level rooms, only darker and sealed away? Alternative researchers argue that the official explanation answers some questions, but not all. They propose that what we are seeing is evidence of a sudden, large-scale event. Not a myth, not a legend. A real, physical catastrophe involving massive amounts of water and liquefied soil. A mud flood that overwhelmed cities, filled streets, and buried structures rapidly, forcing survivors to rebuild on top of what remained. Mainstream historians dismiss this idea quickly. They point out the lack of a single documented global disaster. They argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They warn against connecting unrelated events into a single narrative. And yet, the questions persist. Why does the same architectural anomaly appear in cities with no shared planning authority? Why do these changes cluster between the mid-1800s and early 1900s instead of occurring gradually over centuries? Why do historical accounts focus on rebuilding but rarely describe the initial burial itself? This is where tension lives, between what is recorded and what is visible, between explanation and observation. The mud flood theory does not demand blind belief, but it does demand attention. It asks us to look again at evidence that has been normalized through repetition. To question whether that's just how cities work is always a sufficient answer. History is not only written in books, it is written in stone, brick, and buried streets. Sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not hidden in distant ruins, but in plain sight, beneath the pavement of modern life. And once a question is asked often enough, it stops being fringe and starts becoming unavoidable. This chapter does not conclude with certainty. It ends with a challenge. If the official explanation is complete, then every anomaly should fit neatly within it. If it does not, then something is missing from the story. In the next part of this investigation, we examine a theory that attempts to fill those gaps by introducing a forgotten empire, a missing chapter of history, and structures that seem to appear and disappear without explanation. The mud flood theory does not begin with disaster. It begins with absence. An empire that appears repeatedly on old maps, described in encyclopedias, atlases, and travel accounts for centuries, then seemingly vanishes from mainstream history with little explanation. Its name was Tartaria. Not a single country in the modern sense, but a vast region stretching across Eurasia, appearing on European maps well into the 18th century. Sometimes it is labeled Great Tartary, sometimes Independent Tartary, sometimes simply Tartaria, occupying enormous territory with borders, cities, and internal divisions clearly marked. Then, almost abruptly, it disappears. By the 19th century, Tartaria no longer exists as a political or cultural entity in official narratives. Its lands are absorbed into other nations. Its name fades from maps. Its people are reduced to footnotes, often mischaracterized as nomads or tribal groups, despite earlier descriptions that suggest organized societies with cities, trade routes, and advanced infrastructure. The question is not whether Tartaria was a modern nation-state, but why something so consistently documented could dissolve so completely without a clear historical transition. Proponents of the mud flood theory suggest that Tartaria was not simply conquered or renamed, but erased by catastrophe. They argue that the architectural remnants scattered across the world point to a shared origin. Ornate stone buildings, massive civic structures, symmetrical city layouts, and most notably, star forts. These structures appear across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and even parts of Africa, all sharing the same geometric design. Official history classifies them as military fortifications, built independently by different nations responding to similar defensive needs. But the uniformity raises doubts. Why would dozens of cultures, separated by oceans and politics, adopt nearly identical designs, down to precise angles and proportions? Why do many of these star forts show little evidence of having been used in prolonged warfare? And why do some appear to be integrated into city planning rather than purely defensive positions? Alternative researchers argue that these structures were not merely forts, but part of a larger architectural system associated with a lost or forgotten civilization. A civilization whose buildings were later repurposed, rebranded, or partially buried. In this framework, Tartaria was not a mythic empire, but a placeholder name for a global culture whose traces survive in stone and layout rather than in written history. The mud flood theory suggests that a catastrophic event, or series of events, buried large portions of this civilization under layers of sediment. Cities survived structurally but were rendered unusable at their original ground level. Later societies inherited these spaces, cleared what they could, and rebuilt on top of what remained. Over time, the narrative shifted. What could not be explained was ignored. What could be reused was redefined. Critics argue that this interpretation relies too heavily on speculation and coincidence. They point out that maps can be inaccurate, that names change, and that architectural similarities can arise from shared engineering principles rather than shared origins. These criticisms are valid, and they form an essential part of the discussion. But the theory persists because it connects multiple anomalies into a single question. If Tartaria was merely a misunderstanding or outdated term, why does its disappearance coincide with a global architectural reset? Why does the period in which Tartaria vanishes from maps align with the same era when cities appear to be partially buried and rebuilt? The mud flood theory does not claim to have definitive answers. What it offers instead is a lens, a way of looking at missing history not as a series of isolated errors, but as the aftermath of something disruptive enough to fracture collective memory itself. And to understand how this lens expands beyond maps and names, we must look at a moment in history when impossible buildings appeared, dazzled the world, and were then conveniently destroyed. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, something extraordinary appeared on the global stage. World's fairs. Massive exhibitions designed to showcase human progress, industry, and culture. Chicago in 1893, St. Louis in 1904, San Francisco in 1915. On paper, these were temporary events lasting months or a few short years. But what was built for them defies that description. Photographs show entire cities rising almost overnight. Hundreds of monumental buildings constructed simultaneously, grand halls with domes and columns, palaces covered in ornate sculptures, miles of avenues, canals, bridges, and electrical systems. The Chicago World's Fair alone featured more than 200 large structures spread across an area comparable to a modern downtown, allegedly completed in just 2 years. Official explanations insist these buildings were temporary, made of staff, plaster, and wood over steel frames, designed to be dismantled after the fairs ended. And indeed, many were demolished. But here is where the timeline begins to strain credibility. The level of detail, symmetry, and scale rivals permanent civic architecture. Sculpted facades, massive columns, intricate ornamentation, electrical lighting systems operating at a scale never seen before, all created for structures that were supposedly never meant to last. Alternative researchers ask a dangerous question. What if these buildings were not built from scratch? What if they already existed? They point out similarities between World's Fair architecture and older, unexplained buildings found in cities across the world. The same neoclassical style, the same proportions, the same sense of monumental permanence. In this interpretation, the fairs did not create these structures, but repurposed them, cleaned them, rebranded them as symbols of modern progress while quietly erasing their true origins. Construction timelines become especially problematic when examined closely. Photographs show vast complexes appearing between one fair and the next with minimal visible groundwork. Few images show deep foundations being poured. Instead, buildings seem to emerge fully formed. When demolition occurs, it often looks less like dismantling temporary structures and more like deliberate destruction. Why destroy something so elaborate? Why not convert it into a permanent part of the city? The mud flood theory offers one possible answer. If these buildings were remnants of an earlier civilization, partially buried or abandoned after a catastrophic event, their true origin would be inconvenient. Reusing them temporarily avoids explaining them permanently. Once the fair ends, demolition removes the need for uncomfortable questions. Mainstream historians counter that this interpretation misunderstands period construction methods. They argue that large labor forces, cheap materials, and simplified techniques made rapid construction possible. They cite planning documents and contracts as proof. Again, these explanations address some concerns, but not all. Why does the architecture of the world's fairs look older than the era that supposedly produced it? Why does it align so closely with buildings whose origins are vague or undocumented? And why does this surge of monumental construction occur during the same period when cities worldwide appear to be rebuilding on top of buried streets? The world's fairs sit at the intersection of spectacle and silence, celebrations of progress that may also mark the final chapter of something forgotten. Whether they represent humanity's greatest burst of creativity or the last public appearance of an inherited architecture depends on which questions we are willing to ask. What is certain is this: the fairs did not happen in isolation. They occurred during a time of global rebuilding, missing history, and architectural inconsistencies that refuse to stay buried. To move beyond theory and speculation, we must now examine the evidence that cannot be dismissed as myth or misinterpretation. The photographs themselves, the streets, the buried floors, the cities that still carry the scars of whatever came before. If the mud flood theory has any foundation at all, it lives here, not in maps or names, but in places that can still be walked through today. Beneath modern streets, beneath traffic and storefronts, entire sections of cities remain entombed, preserved not as ruins, but as spaces that were once alive and functional. Nowhere is this more visible than in Seattle's underground city. After the Great Fire of 1889, the official story says the city chose to rebuild higher, raising street levels to prevent future flooding. New sidewalks were constructed above the old ones, and businesses continued operating on the lower floors until entrances were sealed and forgotten. But walking through Seattle's underground tells a more complicated story. These are not crude basements hastily abandoned. They are complete commercial spaces. Storefront windows line the buried streets. Iron grates sit exactly where light would have entered from above. Doorways open into what were once active roads, now frozen in shadow. The alignment is precise. The scale is consistent. It feels less like a planned abandonment and more like a city adapting to a sudden change in ground level. A similar pattern appears in Portland's Shanghai tunnels, officially described as a network of basements and passageways used for storage and illicit activity. The tunnels connect buildings that were clearly designed to operate at a lower street level. Windows face what is now soil. Entrances open into brick walls where streets once ran. Again, these spaces show signs of intentional design, not improvisation. They were meant to be occupied, accessed, and seen. What makes these examples so unsettling is that they are not isolated. Old photographs show street-level transformations in progress, horses and carts hauling away dirt from what appear to be existing roadways, workers excavating down to reveal cobblestone streets beneath modern pavement. In some images, entire building facades are exposed halfway down, their upper floors perfectly aligned with the new street level, while the lower floors remain sealed below. These are not ancient structures being rediscovered centuries later. These are 19th century cities documenting their own burial in real time. The question is not whether street levels changed. That is undeniable. The question is how and why the change appears so abrupt, so widespread, and so uniform across different urban centers. If these lower floors were intentionally buried as part of gradual development, we would expect variation, partial fills, inconsistent depths, irregular transitions. Instead, we see entire districts raised to a new standard height, as if responding to a single event rather than a slow evolution. The ground level did not creep upward. It jumped. Official explanations point again to fires, floods, and sanitation reforms, and in some cases those explanations fit. But in others, the photographic evidence seems to precede the disasters used to justify rebuilding. Buildings already half buried before fires, streets already elevated before infrastructure upgrades. Cause and effect blur, and the timeline becomes difficult to follow. These buried floors are not proof of a global catastrophe by themselves, but they are physical anomalies that demand explanation. They exist. They are accessible. They contradict the idea that basements were always meant to be below ground. They suggest that the cities we see today are layered, not just historically, but physically, built on top of something that did not fully disappear. To understand whether this pattern extends beyond individual case studies, we must widen the lens. When the same architectural phenomenon appears across the world, the question shifts from local planning decisions to global patterns. And that is where the mystery deepens. When individual cities are examined in isolation, anomalies can be explained away. A fire here, a flood there, a sanitation project, a planning decision. But when these same anomalies appear across the world, repeating with striking similarity, coincidence becomes harder to accept. What emerges is not a collection of local oddities, but a global pattern etched into urban landscapes from the mid-19th to early 20th century. San Francisco offers one of the clearest examples. After the 1906 earthquake, the official narrative states that large portions of the city were rebuilt, streets regraded and infrastructure modernized. Yet photographs from the Reconstruction period show something unexpected. Buildings standing intact while massive amounts of earth are piled against them. Streets being excavated downward rather than constructed upward. Lower floors already submerged before debris from the earthquake is even cleared. In many images, the damage from seismic activity appears secondary to the sheer volume of fill surrounding otherwise stable structures. New York tells a similar story. Old images reveal sidewalks raised above original entrances, basement windows lining entire blocks, identical in size and spacing. In some cases, iron grates sit exactly where pedestrian eye level would have been, suggesting a previous street height. Excavation photos from infrastructure projects uncover older pavements, complete with curbs and drainage channels buried beneath layers of compacted soil. These are not isolated finds. They appear repeatedly across Manhattan and other boroughs. London's story stretches even further back. Victorian-era photographs show streets being dug out to reveal earlier roadways several feet below. Building entrances descend downward instead of upward. Windows that once faced the street now sit half-buried behind railings. Moscow, too, displays this pattern, with historical images and modern excavations revealing lower city layers that align neatly across large areas rather than forming irregular archaeological pockets. What ties these cities together is not culture or governance, but timing. Between roughly 1850 and 1920, streets rise almost everywhere, not gradually over centuries, but within a few generations. This same period coincides with rapid rebuilding, massive labor mobilization, and a sudden emphasis on redefining ground level. The question is why this happened globally, not just locally. Basement windows become a standard architectural feature during this time, as if designers were responding to an already altered reality. Buildings constructed afterward often include tall basements with generous windows, suggesting that the concept of ground level had permanently shifted. Architecture adapted to something that had already occurred. Supporters of conventional explanations argue that industrialization itself is the answer. Growing populations, new transportation systems, and modern sanitation required higher streets and deeper foundations. And this argument explains part of the picture, but it does not explain the uniformity. Industrialization did not follow the same timeline everywhere, yet the street-raising phenomenon does. If a single city raises its streets, it is planning. If dozens of cities across the world do so within the same historical window, it begins to resemble response rather than design. Response to what remains the central question. None of this proves a global mud flood, but it does establish something equally important. The physical record does not fully align with the simplicity of the official narrative. There are too many similarities, too many synchronized changes, too many buried streets that look less like the result of progress and more like the aftermath of recovery. To move closer to an answer, speculation must give way to science. What kind of natural processes could bury cities in mud? Could the ground itself behave like liquid on a massive scale? And do we have modern examples that show this is not only possible, but inevitable under the right conditions? That is where the investigation turns next. To understand how entire streets could be buried without reducing cities to piles of rubble, we have to step away from theory and into geology. There is a well-documented natural process capable of doing exactly what the photographs suggest, one that can turn solid ground into something that behaves like liquid. It is called soil liquefaction. Under specific conditions, usually when soil is heavily saturated with water and then subjected to sudden stress, such as seismic activity, the ground can lose its structural integrity almost instantly. It does not crack or collapse in the way people expect. It flows. When liquefaction occurs, Buildings may remain standing while the earth around them shifts dramatically. Roads can sink, rise, or fill with sediment pushed up from below. Sidewalks buckle. Ground levels change unevenly, sometimes by several feet. Structures are not necessarily destroyed, but partially swallowed. Lower floors can disappear beneath layers of mud, while upper floors remain intact and usable. When the soil finally settles, what remains is not devastation in the cinematic sense, but burial. This phenomenon is not hypothetical. It has been observed repeatedly in the modern world. In 2011, Christchurch, New Zealand experienced severe liquefaction after a major earthquake. Entire neighborhoods were flooded with thick, gray sludge forced upward from the ground. Streets vanished beneath mud. Homes stood structurally sound, yet were rendered uninhabitable because their lower levels were filled with compacted sediment. In Japan the same year, liquefaction followed seismic activity and tsunami impact, causing ground deformation across urban areas. Pavement cracked and sank, soil erupted through asphalt, buildings leaned or settled without collapsing. These events were photographed, recorded, and studied extensively by engineers and geologists. They demonstrate a critical point often overlooked in historical discussions. Burial does not require destruction. A city can survive structurally while its ground level changes catastrophically. Walls can remain standing while streets disappear. Now consider this process not as a localized event, but as part of a wider chain of disasters. Large-scale flooding saturates soil across regions. Rivers overflow simultaneously. Prolonged rainfall destabilizes entire floodplains. Under these conditions, the threshold for liquefaction drops dramatically. What normally requires an earthquake can begin to occur under extreme hydraulic pressure alone. Mud becomes mobile. Sediment travels horizontally and vertically, filling voids, streets, and lower floors. Recent history offers an unsettling parallel. Between 2024 and 2025, catastrophic floods in parts of China, India, and Southeast Asia buried modern cities in mud almost overnight. Streets disappeared beneath thick sediment. Vehicles were submerged up to their windows. Buildings remained standing while their lower levels were sealed off by earth. Footage from these events looks disturbingly similar to photographs taken more than a century ago. The difference is not the outcome, but the documentation. Today, we name the disaster immediately. We broadcast it. We explain it in real time. In the 19th century, the world was less connected, less documented, and far less capable of recognizing a global pattern. If widespread flooding and soil liquefaction occurred across multiple regions during that era, it would not have been recorded as a single event. It would have appeared as countless local disasters, each explained in isolation, then slowly absorbed into the background of history. There is another detail that matters. Mud is not just dirt. In flood conditions, fine sediment becomes a transport medium. It moves quickly, settles rapidly, and compacts into dense layers that, decades later, can resemble intentional fill. One severe inundation can coat streets in silt. Repeated events can stack those layers until entire ground levels are altered. If cities already sat on vulnerable soil, a single catastrophic period could bury the same types of spaces everywhere. First floors, storefront thresholds, street-facing windows. Liquefaction does not prove a global mud flood, but it establishes plausibility. It shows that the ground itself can betray civilization, swallowing streets while sparing walls. It demonstrates that burial does not require myth, only physics. And once that door is open, the central question changes. It is no longer whether such an event could happen, but whether the historical record truly reflects how often, how widely, and how severely it already has. When discussions turn to catastrophic floods, skepticism often rises immediately. The word itself feels loaded, too close to legend, too close to mythology. But the events relevant here are neither symbolic nor ancient. They are documented, photographed, and recorded in painful detail. Long before modern cameras and satellites, the 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed floods so destructive that entire towns were erased beneath mud and debris, not as stories, but as headlines. One of the most devastating examples occurred along the Yellow River in China. In 1887, floodwaters breached the river's banks and overwhelmed vast areas of surrounding land. The death toll reached into the millions. Villages disappeared. Cities were buried beneath thick layers of sediment carried by one of the most silt-heavy rivers on Earth. Photographs from the aftermath show landscapes smothered in mud, buildings half submerged, and survivors standing atop what used to be rooftops. In 1931, another flood surpassed even that catastrophe, inundating enormous regions and leaving behind a reshaped terrain where streets, foundations, and entire districts were lost beneath compacted earth. These were not isolated incidents. In 1889, the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania demonstrated how quickly mud and water could annihilate a town. When a poorly maintained dam failed, a wall of water mixed with debris raced downstream, destroying everything in its path. Buildings were lifted, smashed, and then buried beneath layers of sediment and wreckage. Photographs taken afterward show streets unrecognizable, structures submerged up to their second stories, and ground levels permanently altered. The town was rebuilt, but it was never the same city again. What makes these events critical to the discussion is not just their scale, but their physical outcome. Floods do not simply wash things away, they deposit. They leave behind mud, silt, and compacted layers that harden over time. When rebuilding begins, survivors rarely remove every trace of what was deposited. It is faster and safer to level, fill, and build on top of what remains. Over years and decades, the emergency response becomes the new baseline. Photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s consistently show flood aftermaths where streets are not merely damaged, but buried. Lower floors disappear beneath sediment while upper levels remain intact. Doorways are sealed, windows are blocked, new streets are laid above the old ones. These are not theoretical processes. They are visible outcomes of documented disasters. The critical distinction here is that these floods were not myths remembered through oral tradition. They were real events witnessed by millions, recorded by early photographers, and reported in newspapers around the world. And yet, even with this level of documentation, their long-term impact on urban form is rarely emphasized in historical narratives. The focus shifts quickly to recovery, progress, and rebuilding. When viewed individually, each flood appears exceptional. When viewed collectively, a pattern emerges. Large-scale flooding was not rare in the 19th century. It was frequent, deadly, and transformative. And if multiple regions experienced severe inundation within a relatively short historical window, the cumulative effect on global cities could be far greater than any single disaster suggests. This does not require invoking forgotten legends or ancient symbolism. It requires only acknowledging that mud, once settled, becomes part of the landscape. Streets rise not because someone planned them to, but because removing what lies beneath is often impossible. Over time, the memory of why the ground changed fades, replaced by technical explanations and administrative language. By the time the photographs are archived and the streets repaved, the catastrophe itself has already slipped into abstraction. What remains are cities built on top of their own survival layers, quietly carrying the physical record of disasters history prefers to summarize rather than confront. Long before modern geology had names for liquefaction or sediment deposition, cultures across the world preserved memories of destruction in story form. not as precise timelines or measurements, but as warnings, cycles, and resets. These accounts are often dismissed as mythology, symbolic tales created to explain chaos. But when examined side by side, their similarities raise an uncomfortable question. Why did so many civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, remember the end of a world in nearly the same way? In Mesoamerica, the Aztec tradition speaks of the 5 suns, successive ages of the world, each ending in catastrophe. One of these worlds is destroyed by water, drowning humanity and forcing creation to begin again. Survivors are transformed, memory is fragmented, and the new age inherits only traces of what came before. This was not a single flood story, but part of a repeating cycle, suggesting destruction was not an anomaly, but an expected phase of civilization. In China, the legend of Gun and Yu describes a devastating flood that overwhelmed the land for generations. Unlike later historical river floods, this myth speaks of a world where water did not simply recede, but reshaped the terrain itself. Yu succeeds not by stopping the water, but by redirecting it, cutting channels, and redefining the landscape. Civilization resumes only after the earth itself has been altered. The story emphasizes engineering, adaptation, and the acceptance that the old ground is gone. Among Aboriginal Australian cultures, Dreamtime stories recount great floods that submerged ancestral lands and forced people to retreat to higher ground. These accounts are deeply localized, tied to specific geographic features, yet they share a common theme. The land was changed permanently. Coastlines shifted, pathways disappeared. What had once been familiar became unrecognizable. Survival meant learning to live on a transformed world. In Hindu tradition, the story of Manu describes a great deluge that destroys civilization, sparing only a single survivor warned in advance. Manu is instructed to preserve life and knowledge so that the world can begin again. The flood is not framed as punishment alone, but as reset, a clearing of corruption followed by reconstruction on new foundations. What makes these traditions relevant is not their religious framing, but their shared structure. Water overwhelms civilization. The ground is altered. Survivors adapt rather than restore what was lost. Knowledge is fragmented. The new world is similar, but not the same. These stories do not describe gradual decline. They describe abrupt transition. Critics argue that floods are universal human fears, especially among river-based societies, and that similar stories arise independently. This explanation is reasonable, but incomplete. Fear alone does not explain the specificity of burial, terrain change, and reset repeated across cultures. Nor does it explain why these myths often emphasize mud and sediment, not just water. These accounts do not prove a single global event, but they suggest the catastrophic flooding left such a deep impression on human memory that it transcended geography and language. Whether these stories recall one shared disaster or many overlapping ones remains an open question. What matters is that long before photographs existed, humanity remembered something being lost beneath water and earth. And memory, even when distorted by time, rarely invents destruction without cause. When flood traditions from different cultures are placed side by side, the most striking feature is not their differences, but their repetition. Again and again, the same elements surface. Water arrives suddenly. The land is overwhelmed. Civilization does not merely suffer damage, it is erased or buried. Survivors retreat, adapt, and rebuild on altered ground. What came before is remembered imperfectly, filtered through story rather than record. One of the most consistent themes is mud. Not just drowning, but burial. Cities and settlements are described as being swallowed, covered, or pressed into the earth. The emphasis is rarely on waves or storms alone, but on what remains afterward. Thick deposits, changed terrain, a world that looks familiar but no longer functions the same way. This detail is critical because it mirrors what we see in both historical flood photography and modern disasters. Water leaves, mud stays. Another shared element is the idea of reset rather than extinction. Humanity survives, but continuity is broken. Knowledge is lost or fragmented. Social structures collapse and are later reassembled in simpler forms. In many traditions, the survivors do not restore the old world. They inherit a new one. This aligns with a physical reality where rebuilding directly on buried infrastructure is impractical. Instead of uncovering what lies beneath, people adapt to a higher ground level and move forward. There is also a recurring emphasis on memory gaps. In some traditions, survivors are warned in advance but instructed not to preserve everything. In others, the catastrophe is so overwhelming that only fragments of the past remain. This selective survival of knowledge mirrors what happens after real disasters. Records are lost, archives are destroyed. Oral memory replaces documentation. Over generations, explanation gives way to symbolism. Critics argue that these similarities are the result of universal human psychology. Water is essential to life, so its excess naturally becomes a symbol of destruction. But this explanation does not fully address the structural consistency of these stories. They do not merely express fear. They describe process, inundation, deposition, adaptation, reset. These are not abstract ideas. They are observable outcomes of large-scale flooding. Another point often overlooked is timing. Many flood myths, when traced through linguistic and archaeological frameworks, cluster around relatively similar periods of early civilization development. This does not imply a single moment in time, but it does suggest that multiple societies experienced transformative floods close enough together to shape foundational narratives. The memory of these events became embedded not as dates, but as origins. Importantly, none of this requires belief in a single global deluge. Collective memory does not need one cause to produce one pattern. Multiple catastrophes occurring across regions within a few centuries could easily converge into a shared human understanding that civilizations are fragile and that water and earth can erase them quickly. What these myths offer is not proof, but context. They show that the idea of civilization being buried and reset is not a modern invention. It is an ancient intuition, one reinforced not by imagination alone, but by lived experience passed down through generations. When this narrative framework is placed alongside 19th century photographic evidence and geological processes like liquefaction, the question deepens. Are these myths echoes of events far older than our cities? Or are they reminders that the forces capable of burying civilization have always been closer than we think? To move beyond memory and meaning, we must return to what still stands, the structures themselves. The buildings whose scale, symmetry, and sudden appearance raise questions history struggles to answer. Scattered across the world are structures that seem oddly out of place, not because they are ancient, but because they are too consistent. Perfectly geometric, precisely angled, identical in form despite being separated by oceans, empires, and centuries. These are star forts. From Europe to Asia, from North and South America to parts of Africa, hundreds of these structures exist, all sharing the same unmistakable design. Multi-pointed star shapes with sharp bastions, symmetrical layouts, and mathematically precise angles. Official history classifies star forts as military innovations, developed in response to the advent of cannon warfare. The logic is simple. Sloped walls deflect artillery fire. Angular bastions eliminate blind spots. Similar threats produce similar solutions. On paper, the explanation is clean and rational, but when examined more closely, cracks begin to appear. Many star forts were built in locations where no significant battles ever occurred. Some show little evidence of prolonged military use. Others appear integrated into urban planning rather than positioned as isolated defensive structures. In several cases, cities grew around the forts as if they were central civic features rather than peripheral military installations. This raises a question rarely asked. If these were purely defensive, why do they so often resemble planned hubs rather than emergency constructions? The uniformity is also difficult to ignore. The same proportions, angles, and layouts appear in regions that had no direct contact, no shared engineering core, and no centralized authority. Even accounting for the spread of European military theory, the precision and repetition feel excessive. This is not stylistic influence. It is architectural cloning. Alternative researchers suggest that star forts may not have been forts at all, at least not originally. They propose that these structures were part of a global architectural system whose purpose has been misunderstood or deliberately simplified. In this interpretation, their star-shaped geometry may have served functions beyond defense, possibly related to energy flow, resonance, or large-scale planning principles that no longer exist in mainstream engineering. Critics dismiss these ideas as speculative, and rightly so. There is no surviving manual explaining a hidden purpose behind star forts. But absence of explanation does not automatically confirm the official one, especially when the official explanation leaves questions unanswered. Why were these structures built at such scale, often requiring enormous labor and resources, only to be abandoned or repurposed within relatively short periods of time? Why do some appear partially buried, with lower levels filled or sealed, as if the surrounding ground rose after their construction? And why does their timeline overlap so closely with the era of global rebuilding, buried streets, and architectural resets? Photographs and maps from the 17th through 19th century show star forts already in place, sometimes older than the cities surrounding them. In some cases, later construction seems to adapt to the fort rather than the other way around. Streets align with bastions, districts mirror geometric patterns. This suggests inheritance rather than invention. None of this proves that star forts were part of a lost global civilization, but it does challenge the idea that they were simply utilitarian military responses built independently and without deeper significance. Their presence feels more like a fingerprint than a coincidence. If these structures are remnants of something larger, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Who built them, and how? The answer is not found in myth or mystery alone, but in construction timelines that strain the limits of what 19th century technology is supposed to have been capable of. If the architecture itself raises questions, the timelines associated with its construction deepen the mystery. Many of the most elaborate buildings attributed to the 17th through 19th centuries are said to have been erected with astonishing speed. Massive stone structures covered in intricate ornamentation, completed in months or a few short years. Domes, columns, staircases, and decorative facades produced at a scale that rivals modern civic architecture, yet supposedly achieved with limited machinery, manual labor, and rudimentary logistics. The World's Fairs offer a concentrated example of this problem. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 is often cited as a triumph of industrial efficiency. More than 200 monumental buildings spread across a vast area, designed, constructed, electrified, and landscaped in roughly 2 years. Official accounts describe temporary materials and simplified methods, but photographs complicate this narrative. The buildings appear solid, symmetrical, and finely detailed. Close-up images reveal sculptural elements that look carved rather than molded. Staircases, columns, and arches resemble permanent civic buildings, not disposable exhibition halls. Supporters of the conventional explanation argue that large labor forces made this possible. Thousands of workers working long hours, using prefabrication techniques and cheap materials. And while this certainly explains some aspects of rapid construction, it does not fully account for the uniformity and precision seen across so many structures. Temporary buildings do not usually demand perfect symmetry. They do not require monumental staircases or heavy stone-like detailing. Efficiency favors simplicity, not grandeur. Similar questions arise when examining older civic buildings in major cities. Courthouses, train stations, capitol buildings, and municipal halls often appear in the historical record with surprisingly short construction periods. Foundations laid and completed within a year. Entire wings added in months. All during an era when transportation was slow, materials were heavy, and skilled labor was limited. The official explanation points again to human effort. More hands, longer days, lower safety standards. But scale matters. Ornamentation matters. Repetition matters. When the same architectural style appears globally, and when it is consistently associated with compressed timelines, it suggests a process that is not fully explained by manpower alone. Alternative theories point to the possibility of inheritance rather than creation. That many of these buildings were already standing in some form, partially buried or abandoned, and were later restored, modified, or rebranded. Renovation is faster than construction. Cleaning and repairing an existing structure requires far fewer resources than building one from the ground up. This would also explain why early photographs often show buildings emerging from excavation rather than rising from empty ground. A related question concerns labor itself. The 19th century saw the movement of enormous populations of orphaned and displaced children, particularly in North America. The orphan train movement alone relocated hundreds of thousands of children across the continent. Official history frames this as a social response to poverty and urban overcrowding. Alternative interpretations suggest a more unsettling possibility. A society rebuilding rapidly, in need of labor, education, and cultural reprogramming after a major disruption. There is no definitive evidence tying these children to construction projects, but their existence highlights something often overlooked. The 19th century was a period of massive human reorganization. Populations shifted, cities expanded, entire communities appeared and disappeared with little documentation. In such conditions, rebuilding on top of what already existed would have been not only practical, but necessary. Mainstream historians caution against reading too much into these gaps, and rightly so. Records are incomplete. Photography was selective. Survivorship bias shapes what we see. Yet gaps themselves are data. When timelines feel compressed, when documentation is thin, and when architectural sophistication appears suddenly and globally, it becomes reasonable to ask whether something is missing from the story. This does not require belief in lost super technology or secret knowledge. It requires acknowledging that history is written by those who inherit the aftermath, not always by those who experienced the event itself. And when rebuilding becomes the priority, explanation often comes later, simplified and sanitized. To move forward, we must step away from stone and steel and look instead at people. Who was present after this period of transformation? Who was missing? And what does the demographic record suggest about a world that may have been forced to start again? When civilizations experience true catastrophe, the most telling evidence is not always architectural. It is demographic. Who is missing? Who remains? And who suddenly appears in the historical record without a clear origin? The 19th century presents an unusual picture when examined through this lens. Census data from this period is inconsistent, fragmented, and in some regions, conspicuously incomplete. Entire population categories fluctuate sharply between decades, not easily explained by normal birth rates, migration, or war alone. In several countries, especially across North America and parts of Europe, early census records show abrupt increases in population following periods of disaster, rebuilding, or urban expansion. Cities seem to refill quickly after fires, floods, and economic collapses. Official explanations point to rural migration and immigration, and these factors certainly played a role, but they do not fully account for the scale or speed of demographic recovery seen in some regions. One of the most unsettling phenomena of this era is the orphan train movement, which operated roughly between 1854 and 1929. During this period, an estimated 250,000 children were relocated across the United States, transported from overcrowded eastern cities to rural communities in the Midwest and beyond. Official history frames this as a humanitarian effort, a response to poverty, disease, and urban hardship. Children without families were given new homes, new names, and new lives. But the sheer scale of the movement raises difficult questions. Hundreds of thousands of children did not simply lose parents through ordinary circumstances. Something produced them in large numbers, quickly and persistently. Fires, epidemics, and economic hardship explain part of the story, but they do not fully account for the magnitude or duration of the phenomenon. Alternative researchers propose a more controversial interpretation. They suggest that these orphaned children were not only victims of social collapse, but part of a broader repopulation process. A generation growing up after widespread disruption redistributed across a reorganizing society. In this view, the orphan trains were not evidence of neglect alone, but of systemic reconstruction following a period of mass loss. There is no direct evidence that these children were survivors of a single catastrophic event, but history does not require a single cause to produce a single outcome. A sequence of disasters, floods, fires, epidemics, displacement, occurring within a compressed time frame could easily generate a population imbalance large enough to overwhelm existing social structures. Children, being the most vulnerable, would become the most visible symptom. What makes this period particularly strange is how quickly these children were absorbed into new cultural identities. Names were changed, records were lost or rewritten, family histories were severed. Within 1 or 2 generations, disruption disappeared into normality. This is exactly how large-scale societal resets behave. The first generation adapts. The second forgets. The third assumes the new world is the only one that ever existed. Mainstream historians caution against drawing sweeping conclusions from incomplete data, and this caution is justified. Census records from the 19th century are imperfect. Many births and deaths went unrecorded. Migration was chaotic. Yet imperfection itself tells a story. Periods of stability leave clean records. Periods of upheaval do not. If a widespread catastrophe had occurred, even without a single defining moment, its demographic signature would look exactly like this. Sudden loss, rapid redistribution, cultural reset. A generation raised in the aftermath, taught how the world works without ever being told why it changed. To understand whether this interpretation has merit, we must look beyond people and return briefly to technology. Not to claim impossibilities, but to ask a simpler question. If societies were forced to rebuild quickly, what knowledge might have been lost, simplified, or quietly abandoned in the process? Periods of collapse do not only erase people, they erase systems. Knowledge that depends on continuity is fragile, and when societies are forced into survival mode, practicality replaces sophistication. The 19th century sits at a strange intersection in this regard. On one hand, it is remembered as an age of invention and progress. On the other, it marks the disappearance of techniques, technologies, and architectural capabilities that appear suddenly advanced and then quietly abandoned. Alternative researchers point to certain buildings attributed to the Tartarian period and ask uncomfortable questions. Massive structures with minimal visible heating systems, large open interiors designed for airflow rather than insulation, tall towers, domes, and spires positioned in ways that seem optimized for atmospheric interaction. From this perspective, some architecture may have functioned as part of energy systems that relied not on combustion, but on environmental forces such as atmospheric electricity. Claims of free energy are understandably controversial. There is no surviving blueprint that proves such systems existed, and many modern interpretations rely on speculation. But skepticism cuts both ways. The absence of documentation does not automatically imply absence of function. If a civilization inherited structures without understanding their original purpose, simplification would be inevitable. Complex systems are difficult to maintain without knowledge. Easier methods replace them. Over time, the old ways are dismissed as decorative, symbolic, or obsolete. Mainstream explanations counter that these buildings were designed with now outdated but well-understood principles of ventilation, daylighting, and passive climate control. And in many cases, this explanation is sufficient, but it does not address why these design philosophies appear globally, then fade almost simultaneously as industrial systems take over. Nor does it explain why so many structures were retrofitted, sealed, or dismantled, rather than adapted. This leads to the most contentious aspect of the reset hypothesis, the idea of a cover-up. Not necessarily a coordinated conspiracy, but a gradual narrowing of narrative. After catastrophe, societies need stability. They need simple stories, clear progress, and confidence in authority. Acknowledging that the world was recently broken, that civilization failed on a massive scale, is destabilizing. It undermines trust in permanence. From this perspective, erasure does not require secret meetings or hidden archives. It happens naturally. Records are lost in disasters. Survivors prioritize rebuilding, not documentation. New institutions frame the past in ways that support continuity rather than rupture. Over time, what was once emergency adaptation becomes official history. There is also a more generous interpretation. Perhaps nothing was deliberately hidden. Perhaps the truth was simply too complex to preserve. Multiple disasters, overlapping causes, and uneven recovery do not produce clean narratives. They produce confusion. And confusion, when passed through generations, hardens into simplification. The reset hypothesis does not demand belief in lost super technologies or malicious intent. At its core, it suggests something more human. That civilization is capable of forgetting its own fragility. That when forced to rebuild, it smooths over the cracks, labels survival as progress, and moves forward without looking down at what was buried to make that movement possible. Whether this forgetting was accidental or intentional remains open to debate. What matters is that the physical world still carries evidence of transition. Sealed doorways, repurposed buildings, technologies that appear briefly, then vanish. Together, they form a pattern that invites scrutiny rather than dismissal. To evaluate these claims honestly, we must now turn to the voices that reject them. The archaeologists, historians, and urban planners who argue that nothing mysterious occurred at all. If the reset hypothesis is wrong, its weaknesses should be visible under scientific examination. That is where the investigation goes next. Before any extraordinary conclusion can be taken seriously, the ordinary explanations must be examined in full. Urban archaeologists, historians, and civil engineers argue that nothing about buried streets or lowered windows requires catastrophe. According to this view, Cities are not static creations, but layered systems, continuously modified to solve practical problems. What appears mysterious today is simply the cumulative result of centuries of incremental decisions. From this perspective, raised streets were not reactions to sudden burial, but deliberate engineering solutions. In the 19th century, many rapidly growing cities faced severe sanitation crises. Streets sat below sewer lines, waste pooled in low-lying areas. Flooding was frequent and deadly. Raising street levels allowed gravity-based sewer systems to function more effectively and reduced standing water that spread disease. This process was documented in city council records, engineering plans, and contemporary newspapers. Fire rebuilding plays a central role in this explanation. Cities like Chicago, San Francisco, and Seattle suffered massive fires that destroyed large portions of their urban cores. Rebuilding provided an opportunity to modernize. Streets were widened, graded, and elevated. New foundations were laid on top of old ones to create more stable platforms for heavier masonry buildings. Lower floors were sealed not because they were buried by disaster, but because incorporating them into new street levels was more efficient than demolishing everything and starting over. Urban archaeologists also emphasize that what we now call basements were often intended to be semi-subterranean from the beginning. In colder climates, partially sunken floors helped regulate temperature. In commercial districts, lower levels were used for storage, deliveries, and mechanical systems. Large windows were included to bring in light and air, not because these spaces were meant to be primary living areas, but because designers understood the importance of ventilation long before modern HVAC systems existed. Excavation photographs, according to this interpretation, are frequently misunderstood. Digging down does not necessarily mean uncovering something lost. It often means accessing existing infrastructure for repair or modification. When new roads were installed, older layers had to be removed or adjusted. The presence of older streets beneath newer ones is expected in any long-lived city. Rome, London, and Paris all exhibit multiple stacked roadways, each representing a different phase of development. From a professional standpoint, there is nothing unusual about uniformity either. Engineering standards spread quickly during the industrial era. Once a particular street height or foundation depth proved effective, it was replicated widely. Architects designed buildings to anticipate future grading changes, especially in flood-prone areas. What appears today as suspicious. Consistency may simply reflect best practices being adopted at scale. This perspective insists that cities were not buried and then rediscovered. They were continuously rebuilt, reshaped, and optimized. The lower layers we see today are not evidence of amnesia or reset, but of efficiency. Removing old structures completely is costly. Building over them saves time, labor, and materials. Over decades, these decisions accumulate into the layered cities we inhabit now. Yet even within this framework, some questions remain unresolved. Urban archaeology explains how cities change, but it struggles to explain why so many cities changed in such similar ways within such a compressed time frame. It accounts for the process, but not always the synchronization. And it explains intention, but not perception. Why do so many photographs feel less like construction and more like recovery? To address these lingering doubts, proponents of the mainstream view attempt to directly dismantle the most common claims made by reset theorists. If the anomalies can be explained individually, the larger pattern may dissolve under scrutiny. That effort begins next. Those who reject the reset hypothesis argue that its strongest appeal lies not in evidence, but in interpretation. According to this view, ordinary features of urban development are being reframed as anomalies simply because modern observers are unfamiliar with how 19th century cities actually functioned. When examined carefully, many of the most frequently cited claims dissolve under closer inspection. Take basement windows, for example. Reset proponents often describe them as proof that entire floors were once at street level. Urban historians counter that these windows were a standard design feature. Before electric lighting and mechanical ventilation, large basement windows were essential. They allowed daylight, airflow, and even storefront visibility into lower levels used for workshops, kitchens, storage, or commercial activity. Iron grates were installed not because these spaces were later buried, but because they opened directly onto sidewalks and needed protection from foot traffic. Another common claim involves so-called buried buildings. Archaeologists point out that what appears to be burial is often deliberate infill. When cities raised streets, they filled the space between the old and new grades with compacted material to create stable surfaces for heavier construction. This was not an emergency response, but a planned engineering solution. Old entrances were sealed, new ones cut higher, and buildings adapted rather than demolished. From a cost and safety perspective, this made sense. Construction timelines are also frequently misunderstood. While they appear compressed by modern standards, 19th century building practices relied on massive labor forces working under conditions that would be illegal today. 10 to 12-hour workdays, 6 or 7 days a week were common. Materials were sourced locally. Designs were standardized. Ornamentation was often cast or molded rather than carved by hand. What seems impossible today was achievable under different economic and social realities. World's Fair buildings in particular are often mischaracterized. Although they appear monumental in photographs, most were constructed using lightweight materials over steel frames. Their visual grandeur was intentional spectacle, not structural permanence. When dismantled, they deteriorated quickly, confirming their temporary nature. Surviving documentation supports this interpretation, even if the imagery continues to provoke doubt. From the mainstream perspective, the reset hypothesis relies heavily on visual intuition. Something looks buried, therefore it must have been buried suddenly. Something looks too elaborate, therefore it must be older than claimed. Historians caution that intuition is not evidence. Context matters. Without understanding the constraints, technologies, and priorities of the era, modern viewers risk projecting present-day assumptions onto the past. And yet, even after these rebuttals, the discussion does not fully close. Because while each claim can be addressed individually, the overall pattern still invites scrutiny. Why do so many cities show the same architectural adaptations? Why do these changes cluster so tightly in time? Why does the visual record so often convey disruption rather than gradual transition? Mainstream scholarship provides plausible explanations, but plausibility is not the same as completeness. History is not a courtroom verdict. It is an evolving reconstruction. New questions do not invalidate old answers, but they can reveal where those answers stop short. The most productive approach may not be choosing between catastrophe and continuity, but accepting that reality often exists between extremes. Cities can evolve gradually and still be shaped by moments of crisis. Records can be accurate and still incomplete. And what looks like a reset may in fact be a series of overlapping disruptions that, taken together, resemble something far larger. With that in mind, the investigation now turns forward rather than backward. Because if mud, water, and instability reshaped cities once, they are doing so again in our own time. And this time, we are watching it happen live. What once required interpretation through old photographs and fragmented records is now unfolding in real time. In the mid-2020s, catastrophic flooding events across multiple regions of the world have produced scenes that feel uncomfortably familiar. Entire city districts submerged not just in water, but in thick, heavy mud. Streets erased overnight, ground floors rendered unusable while upper levels remain intact. Infrastructure surviving structurally, yet functionally buried. In 2024, large parts of China experienced extreme flooding after prolonged rainfall overwhelmed river systems and urban drainage networks. Footage shows streets transformed into channels of moving sediment. Cars disappear up to their windows. Storefronts vanish beneath compacted earth. When the water recedes, what remains is not a clean surface, but layers of mud that harden quickly, locking in a new ground level. Cleanup does not mean restoration. It means adaptation. Debris is cleared, surfaces are leveled, and life continues on top of what cannot be fully removed. India's monsoon seasons during this same period produced similar outcomes. Entire neighborhoods in flood-prone cities were submerged repeatedly, saturating the soil to the point where the ground itself began to shift. Roads collapsed or rose unevenly. Buildings that remained standing were rendered inaccessible at street level. In many cases, authorities sealed lower floors permanently, declaring them unsafe, and redirected activity upward. The visual result mirrors 19th century photographs almost exactly. Doorways cut off, windows half buried, new access points created above the original street. Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia saw comparable events. Floodwaters mixed with sediment from construction sites, riverbanks, and soft soil zones, producing mud flows that filled urban spaces with startling speed. Modern materials, modern engineering, modern warning systems, and still the same outcome. The city does not wash away, it sinks into itself. What these events demonstrate is not technological failure, but vulnerability. Urban environments are especially susceptible to saturation. Concrete and asphalt trap water. Drainage systems become overwhelmed. Once soil reaches a critical point, liquefaction can occur without seismic activity. The ground behaves less like a foundation and more like a fluid medium, redistributing itself around whatever stands on top of it. The most revealing aspect of these modern disasters is the response. Authorities do not attempt to excavate entire districts back to their original state. That would be impractical, expensive, and dangerous. Instead, they reinforce what remains, raise surfaces, and redefine normal. Streets are repaved higher, buildings are retrofitted, lower levels are written off. Within months, the city functions again, but on altered terms. Now imagine this process repeated across multiple regions over several decades, in an era without instant communication or global coordination. Each event explained locally, each recovery framed as progress. Over time, the shared cause disappears, leaving only the physical outcome. Modern floods do not prove that a past reset occurred, but they provide a reference point. They show how quickly cities can be buried without collapsing. They show how easily altered ground levels can become permanent. And most importantly, they show how fast memory shifts from catastrophe to normality once rebuilding begins. The past no longer needs to be imagined. It can be observed in the present. And that observation leads to a final, unavoidable question. If events like this are happening now, on a regional scale, could they happen again on a global one? Once modern floods are placed beside historical evidence, the question shifts from speculation to probability. Not whether cities can be buried, but how often the conditions for burial align. The forces involved are not exotic. They are familiar: water, soil, gravity, and pressure. What has changed is scale. Climate systems are becoming more volatile. Rainfall patterns are intensifying. Urban expansion is placing more weight on unstable ground than ever before. Climate data observed over recent decades shows a clear increase in extreme precipitation events. Storms that once occurred once in a century now arrive every few years. River systems are pushed beyond historical limits. Coastal cities face rising water tables even without surface flooding. This means that saturation, the key ingredient for liquefaction and mud inundation, is becoming more common, not less. Modern cities are especially vulnerable because of how they are built. Layers of concrete and asphalt prevent water from draining naturally. Underground infrastructure creates voids that weaken soil stability. When flooding occurs, water has nowhere to go. It pools, presses downward, and destabilizes the ground beneath entire districts at once. The result is not collapse, but displacement. Streets rise, foundations shift, lower levels become liabilities. Geology compounds the risk. Many major cities sit on river deltas, floodplains, or reclaimed land. These locations were chosen historically for trade and access, not stability. Under prolonged saturation, such soils behave unpredictably. Liquefaction zones mapped by modern geologists overlap almost perfectly with areas that show historical evidence of buried streets and raised ground levels. This is not coincidence. It is vulnerability repeating itself. Could these conditions align globally? Not in a single moment, perhaps, but over a compressed period? Yes. Climate systems operate on planetary scales. Large oscillations affect multiple continents simultaneously. A few decades of intensified flooding, coupled with seismic activity and rapid urbanization, could reshape cities worldwide without any single defining event to point to. The outcome would look exactly like what we see in the historic record. Synchronized adaptation without synchronized memory. The idea of a reset does not require a clean break or dramatic ending. It can occur through accumulation. Each disaster pushes societies slightly off their previous baseline. Each rebuilding effort locks in a new normal. After enough iterations, the original world becomes unreachable, physically and psychologically. This is what makes the mud flood theory unsettling, even if one rejects its more extreme claims. It reframes civilization not as a steady ascent, but as a series of recoveries. Progress becomes layered on top of survival. History becomes less about invention and more about adaptation. If this is true, then the question is no longer whether our ancestors experienced something we forgot. It is whether we are currently experiencing the early stages of something future generations will misunderstand. Will they look at our cities, our photographs, our records, and wonder why the ground level seems wrong? Will they debate whether the changes were gradual or catastrophic? We often assume that because we document everything, nothing can be forgotten. But documentation does not preserve meaning. It preserves fragments. And fragments, without context, are easy to misinterpret. To close this investigation, we must step back from evidence and theory and confront the uncertainty itself. Because some mysteries are not meant to be solved conclusively. They are meant to change how we look at the ground beneath us. At this point, the investigation does not move forward by adding new claims. It moves forward by slowing down and looking again at what has already been placed on the table. Photographs of buried streets, geological processes capable of liquefying entire districts, documented floods that reshaped cities in a single night, architectural styles that appear suddenly, globally, and then fade, demographic disruptions that suggest recovery rather than continuity. None of these elements alone demands a radical conclusion, but together, they resist dismissal. The strongest argument against a hidden catastrophe is not that these things did not happen, but that they can be explained individually. Streets were raised for sanitation. Buildings were repurposed for efficiency. Floods were local. Architecture followed fashion. Population shifts followed economics. Each explanation is plausible. Each is supported by some record. Yet plausibility is not the same as completeness, and this is where unease remains. History prefers linear stories, cause, effect, progress. But the physical world is not linear. It is layered. Cities are not written once, they are overwritten repeatedly. When the ground level changes, the past does not disappear. It is sealed. When societies rebuild, they do not always pause to document what they are standing on. Survival compresses memory. Reconstruction reframes trauma as improvement. The mud flood theory, at its most restrained, does not claim that a single lost empire ruled the world or that knowledge was erased by design. Its more compelling suggestion is quieter and more difficult to refute. That civilization experienced a period of severe environmental disruption in the recent past, disruptive enough to alter cities globally, yet fragmented enough to avoid a single name. That what we call modernization may, in part, be adaptation to damage rather than purely advancement. There are three broad possibilities. The first is gradual development. Cities grew, problems arose, solutions were implemented, and the anomalies we see today are the normal byproduct of long-term urban evolution. The second is catastrophe. A series of intense, overlapping disasters forced rapid rebuilding on a global scale, leaving behind buried layers that were never fully explained. The third lies between them. A world shaped by both slow change and sudden shocks, where recovery blurred into progress so seamlessly that the rupture itself faded from awareness. What keeps the mystery alive is not the lack of answers, but the persistence of unanswered questions. Why do so many cities share the same architectural scars? Why do flood myths emphasize burial rather than destruction? Why do construction timelines feel compressed across different regions? Why does the photographic record so often resemble excavation instead of construction? And why does the modern world still produce the same outcomes under similar conditions? These questions do not accuse history of deception. They challenge it to be honest about uncertainty, because forgetting does not always require intent. Sometimes it only requires time, rebuilding, and the human desire to believe that the ground beneath us has always been stable. In the final part of this chapter, we step away from analysis and return to reflection, because the most unsettling aspect of this theory is not what it claims about the past, but what it suggests about the present. Perhaps the truth is not hidden in ancient manuscripts or lost civilizations, but in places so familiar we stop questioning them. Beneath sidewalks, behind sealed doorways, under streets we cross every day without noticing their depth. The mud flood theory does not demand belief. It asks for attention. It asks us to look at our cities not as finished achievements, but as layered survivors of forces larger than planning and politics. We have examined photographs that show streets being unearthed rather than built. We have explored geological processes capable of burying cities without destroying them. We have looked at myths that remember water and mud as agents of reset, and at modern floods that reproduce the same outcomes in real time. We have considered architecture that appears suddenly, globally, and then vanishes from practice. We have acknowledged mainstream explanations that account for much, but not all, of what remains visible. Three possibilities stand before us. The first is that nothing extraordinary occurred, and that urban development alone explains every anomaly. The second is that a series of large-scale catastrophes reshaped the world's cities within a relatively short historical window, leaving behind physical evidence but fragmented memory. The third, and perhaps most likely, is that reality sits between these extremes. That civilization advanced, but not without interruption. That progress was built on top of recovery. And that what we call history is, in part, a record of what survived being buried. Unanswered questions remain, and they deserve to remain open. Why does identical architecture appear across continents? Why do flood myths align so closely in structure and theme? Why do construction timelines feel compressed, even by the standards of their time? Why does photographic evidence from the 19th century look so consistently like excavation after disaster rather than construction before occupation? These questions do not weaken history. They strengthen it. They remind us that the past is not a closed system, and that certainty is often a luxury of distance. The ground beneath our cities is not neutral. It is an archive, compressed and silent, holding stories that were never written down because the priority was survival, not explanation. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: if such a reset happened once, it did not require myth, gods, or forgotten empires. It required only water, earth, and time. The same ingredients that continue to shape the world today. So the question is no longer whether the mud flood theory is conspiracy or catastrophe. The question is whether we are willing to accept that civilization is more fragile and more forgetful than we like to believe. Because the truth may not be waiting to be discovered in distant ruins or ancient texts. It may be buried beneath our feet, in the cities we walk through every day. What do you think? Evidence of a reset, or an urban legend shaped by coincidence and interpretation? If history has more to say, it will not speak from the sky. It will rise quietly from the ground.